Ted Phillips is our guest tonight on Conundrums. Ted goes way back in the UFO field. He used to work with Dr. J. Allen Hynek, and he has formed the Center for Physical Trace Research. This is where you investigate actual UFO landings, and you'd be surprised how many there are. Ted Phillips is next on Conundrums. Tonight on Conundrums, we're talking with Ted Phillips of the Center for Physical Trace Research. Ted, thank you for being on Conundrums.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Well, let's just get right into it. You started in ufology, back with Dr. J. Allen Hynek, right? Tell me about your beginnings in this field.
Yeah, actually, I started having an interest in it when I was 9. And listening to some of the military reports that were being reported over the Mutual radio network, and was pretty fascinated with it. And my dad was at a local radio station, and the newsman there, Bob Younger, had been a bomber pilot in World War II. And knowing my interest, Dad said, well, let me introduce you to this guy. I think you'll like to talk to him. And Bob was flying a night intruder bomber over Europe, and had an entire wing of these bombers. And all of a sudden they see a circular bright object coming in from their right, and it flies very close, very near, and over the bomber complement. And as it went over, the planes were actually rocked by some kind of air disturbance. And they watched, and after it cleared the bombers, without hesitating, it reversed direction and flew back underneath, again, gyrating the bombers. And I mean, that really hooked me when I actually got to talk to this guy. And many, many years later, he saw me on an NBC News television news show. And he, over the years, had pulled together all of the names of all the crew members, plane numbers, every detail, and sent them to me. And that, I thought that was, quite exceptional.
How old were you when you first met this man? How old were you?
I was, I was 12.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. Then in 1964, we had the Socorro, New Mexico landing. And I went down and was looking into that. Well, J. Allen Hyneks was there, but we didn't know each other from anyone. And 4 years later, I ran onto an exceptional case. It was a physical trace case, multiple witness, daylight, UFO on the ground taking off 300 feet from these guys. And they shot 2 photos of it, daylight, sharp images, best I've ever seen of a UFO. And so anyway, this was an exceptional thing. And I thought, well, I'll just take a shot. And I called Northwestern University. And Mary, Allen's secretary, said, hang on. And surprised the devil out of me, he comes on. And we talked for about 15 minutes. And he said, can we talk to the witnesses and see the pictures? And I said, sure. So he flew down to Columbia, Missouri in a couple of weeks. And after that, I gave him a number of cases that I'd investigated on my own. And he takes them back to Chicago, and about 2 weeks calls and invites me to come up for a couple of days. And I spent those 2 days talking with Fred Beckman, and Bill Powers at Northwestern. And he asked me if I would like to join his investigative group, which was known as the Invisible College. And considering the fact working with J. Allen and Jacques Vallee, I mean, come on, what are you going to say,
Right.
you know?
Now, did the things the information that you fed to him, did they end up in Project Blue Book, or was this after Blue Book?
No, this was actually during Blue Book. This was in 1968. And they did not go into Blue Book. Allen kind of sat on them. And because at that point he was convinced if he gave any of this stuff to Blue Book, it will just go down the rat hole to some other agency. That was quite apparent.
Okay. And at what point did you start the Center for Physical Trace Research?
That was in 1998.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1968, Allen and I were having dinner in St. Louis, and he said, you know, we have so much stuff coming in, we can't investigate it all. And he said, we need to start specializing in particular types of events. Mm-hmm. And so after he went through a litany of types of events, he said, would you be willing to go into physical traces mm-hmm. from UFO landing cases? And I said, sure. And the really cool thing was a year later at my first presentation with Hynek and Vallee and Andrus and the Lorenzens and in the front row, and I was a little nervous. And I had 157 cases, mm-hmm. and everybody was blown away. That many landings with traces.
Yes. And
the file now is just below 4,000 from 93 countries.
4,000 cases where UFOs have landed on the ground and disturbed the ground in some way?
Yes, where the UFO is actually seen generating the trace.
Is this worldwide or in the United States?
93 countries.
Do you go to other countries and investigate landings?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Not as much anymore because I'm pretty well tied down with the Marley Woods. Mm-hmm. And that's quite a big project for me now.
Tell me about Marley Woods. This is something that you're currently investigating, right?
Yes. Yeah. 12 years ago, I had a call from one of the witnesses. And asking me if I would be willing to come down and help them out with some really odd stuff that was going on. And I almost turned it down because there were no physical trace cases. And he did mention to me, he said, we have taken some video. So I thought, okay, I can do a trip for that. And after I talked to these people, they were, you know, high quality witnesses. And the gentleman's a banker and a rancher. And so as I visited the area more and more, I actually, after 5 months, had the opportunity for the first time ever to see something I couldn't identify. Ah, okay. And since that time, I've seen a lot. And I'm really amazed to be able to say that.
What did you see?
Well, what I saw, the owner and I of the North Ranch were standing out by an old windmill, just sort of going over cases. And all of a sudden he says, there they are. And I look up, and it's twilight, but it's still very bright.
Mm-hmm.
And in the northeast, there are three amber-colored devices, and they're in a horizontal row. No sound, no wings, no motors, nothing, no means of support that you could see. And parachutes, smoke, anything like that would have been quite visible. And a fourth one comes on more to the east, and then a fifth one. The fifth one was actually quite close, about 800 feet away, and probably 600 feet above the ground. And so I'm staying there just transfixed by this thing. And they were so different from anything I would have expected. Mm-hmm. Had it been a metallic disc with little guys crawling all over it, I would have been comfortable with it. But this was way, way different. And the things looked to be about 12 feet vertically, about 8 feet horizontally. And the entire face was this odd amber color. And it was extremely bright, yet soft. Very difficult to explain the appearance. Yeah. And coming around the outside edge from the top and down around the bottom and up the other side, configuring a U shape, was a band of the oddest purple blue color I've ever seen. And back 12 years ago, I was still looking for oil leaks or a piece that had fallen off of something or anything that you could pick up in your hand, and was not at all big on aerial sightings. And yet, contrary to everything I'd ever believed, my brain was telling me something might come out of or through these things.
Right.
Nothing did, unfortunately, but I've developed that theory much more soundly now. But it was quite a thing. And the really trick thing was, here I was a very long time investigator, pretty well knew what to expect generally. And I was standing there for a minute and 37 seconds with the camcorder running, recording, aimed at the ground. And I didn't think for a split second until right at the end, and I got about 1 or 2 seconds of the fifth object.
That's gotta hurt. That's gotta hurt.
Oh,
when
it does.
it
Yes,
in your
it
hands.
does.
Yeah. You said that they were devices. Did they rotate? Did they spin? Or how did they fly? Did they fly aerodynamically or appear to just move in position?
Well, they did not move at all, not up or down, sideways. There was no visible motion at all. And that was really the bewildering thing, to see these 5 things suspended in the air with plenty enough light to see anything that might have been hanging on or off of. And I mean, it really kind of sets you back. And the really odd thing, and I've seen a number of these ambers since, sometimes in numbers of 15, 16, and in all kinds of configurations. But the fascinating thing is, when they appear, it's like an old camera lens, a shutter opening. They go from nothing and they expand. And then when they disappear, they go back into that shutter closing down configuration. And I was lucky enough, once I got CCD cameras set up where you have good stable platforms 24/7, I was standing one morning at the same ranch just before sunup, and I was talking to Tom Ferrario, who's on the team, and I was facing east, and for some reason I shifted a little bit to the left. Right behind his head in the sky was this brilliant silvery object, circular, and I yelled at Tom. By the time he turned around, it was gone. Well, I've seen a number of identical objects to this, but this was the first instance where I actually had video I could look at and look at over and over.
Mm-hmm.
And the really incredible thing is, and no matter how much I believe in physical stuff, it appeared that this thing, it was a nice blue sky just before sunrise. Sun was about on the horizon. It appeared this thing came out of the sky itself. In other words, as though it came through a hole in the sky. I know that sounds crazy. And it was there for about 9 seconds, and it went back into that hole or rift or whatever.
Did it come out, fly around, then go back into a hole, or it
no.
just appeared and then disappeared?
Yeah, it came out and it did not move. It stayed in that same spot for 9 seconds and then retreated back into nothingness. And this sort of stuff goes on at Marley. I have nearly 1,000 cases reported over the last 12 years and 234 witnesses. And not one witness has ever has ever gone public with any of their experiences. So, it's not like you make up a big lie and keep it to yourself. I mean, these people are very credible.
Mm-hmm. And you said it's Marley Woods. So are you in a forest when this happens, or are you in an open area?
It's a very remote, heavily wooded area. Mm-hmm. A lot of bluffs and hollows, and just exactly after all those years of investigating landings, it's exactly where I would expect there to be a concentration of activity. Okay. Because one of the most solid patterns statistically on the landing cases involved the fact that 97% of the landing cases, it's like the object would find the most isolated farm, the most isolated spot on that farm to land. And they certainly were not looking to be seen by anyone.
Why do you suppose that is, that they pick out of the way places where they would not be seen?
Yeah, I think they, whatever they're about, they're not interested in talking to us, and which disturbs me a lot about the abduction cases, because so many of the landing events, the farmer hears his dogs barking or the electrical power to the house goes out, which gets his attention. He steps out on the back steps and he sees a light way down in the woods. So he gets a shotgun, a flashlight, and he heads for the woods. And in the greatest percentage of those events, he'll see a small guy, a couple of small guys muddling around under the object, which is sitting on 3 or 4 legs, landing legs. And in the opposite to the abduction things, they don't run out and grab this farmer and drag him on board and take him away. And I find that really interesting because it would be the perfect scenario. It's just the 2 little guys and the farmer, and no one would even know what had happened. It just seems odd to me. But
it's as if we landed on the moon and someone walked up and saw our craft. They're out there, they're gathering rocks, they're gathering samples. Is that? Yeah, it's what you would expect someone from outer space to come here and do. They're checking out our planet.
Yeah, exactly. And if they were not taking samples or just plain looking around, it appeared that they were working on the object. So, I don't know, repairs or whatever.
Yeah, maybe
trying to find an O'Reilly parts or something. I don't know.
It's kind of a pit stop. Let's get out and check them. Open the hood and check everything out.
But they never relieved themselves. I was always looking for anything. So
exactly. How many cases where there's physical evidence on the ground have you investigated where there was also the visual sighting of the occupants around it?
In the total cases um, let's see, I've got to think right now, 19.1% of all the cases involved humanoids.
Mm-hmm.
And well over 90% were little 3 foot, 3.5 foot guys.
Mm-hmm. What are they described as? Are they consistently described the same way, or is it different kinds of extraterrestrials or whatever they are?
Well, basically they're identical.
Mm-hmm.
Slightly enlarged heads, prominent eyes, thin, spindly bodies, kind of long fingers, and long, thin arms.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just sort of the same thing over and over and over. And what I started finding really interesting was, for example, you have a landing in the 1920s.
Mm-hmm.
There was a good one in Iowa. I've always loved that case, daylight. And the witness sees two little guys,
Mm-hmm.
describes their clothing and what they look like and so on, and the object in the 20s. Then you see an almost identical object in guys in the 40s, then in the 50s or 60s, then in the 80s. And I started thinking, well, wouldn't they at least change clothes once in a while? And then all of a sudden the light bulb came on. What if they're all leaving on the same day or the same week?
Uh-huh. Or maybe they're leaving and then coming back, and time has passed for us, but maybe for them it's still the same day.
Exactly. I more and more I've really considered the possibilities of time manipulation, other dimensions. At this point, I'm a little confused
Mm-hmm.
because I see things that just shouldn't be, even in ufology.
Right.
And more and more, I'm finding. I started seeing it with landing cases years ago, but I'm finding more and more now that there seems to be a connection between UFOs and what we call the paranormal.
Okay. What is the connection?
Well, for example, there was this case in Iowa where a lady and her two adult sons live in this two-story home, an old home out in the country, and it had been snowing. There was some ice on the ground, and one of the sons walks by an upstairs window, and about 10, 15 feet from the window is a device, a machine, and through a sort of window or opening, he could see two figures inside, and they were doing something to something in front of him, which he couldn't see. And so he yells at mom and brother, and they thunder up to the second floor, and all three stand there in daylight watching this thing suspended right outside their bedroom window. And after quite a prolonged period of time, the thing backs away a bit from the window, and the guys are still visible, and it goes vertically up and out of sight. So they immediately run out into the yard over which this thing had been hovering, and the ice was melted in a nice, neat 10-foot circular pattern down to the soil,
Mm-hmm.
and the soil had been dehydrated, and just like you were zapped, it was zapped with a microwave oven, which is very, very common
Mm-hmm.
in traces. And when they re-entered the house for the first time ever, they noticed dishes were flying across the kitchen and all kinds of poltergeist activity. And that continued in that house from that point on, and had never been there before.
Wow.
And now I'm getting into events in daylight where an invisible something, for example, herds an entire herd of cattle into a corner of a field in a very, very tight, packed herd, and holds them there for 45 minutes while the owner's watching. And yet he could see nothing doing this. And the thing that I related to, most people are much more familiar with, is the Skinwalker Ranch in Utah.
Okay. Tell me about that.
Well, that's a ranch that Bob Bigelow bought a number of years ago, following the some new owners bought this ranch and moved in, and almost immediately they started having, believe me, some pretty terrifying experiences. And as an example, they saw a lot of the baseball-sized light balls.
Mm-hmm.
And this is another feature of Marley Woods, and I've managed to see a lot of those. And but some of the light balls, the blue ones and the red ones, seem to be extremely dangerous. Actually, a threat to animals, especially. And so the owner and his wife and adult son are standing outside talking one afternoon, and one of the small blue objects comes in and is kind of playing around with the dogs, and they had three adult labs, and so the dogs would get excited, jump at the light ball, it would come down, it would go up, and then it started moving away a little bit at a time, and the dogs, in this playful mood, are following it.
Mm-hmm.
And they watch as the light ball and the dogs go into a clump of trees, and then they hear the dogs just yelping and screaming, quite obviously in a lot of pain, serious pain.
Mm-hmm.
And the owner and his son run down there, and the light ball is gone, and what they find, the dogs, are three kind of greasy areas.
Yeah.
And so, and a lot of that sort of stuff goes on up there. And we're having similar stuff at Marley.
And it's often been said sometimes in the UFO community that the extraterrestrials are tricksters. So you think this is borne out from evidence like this?
I really think so. I talked with Bob Bigelow and Colin Kelleher, and we discussed events from Marley and from Skinwalker. And one of the things that they believe, and they pointed out, was it's like it's a sort of game.
Mm-hmm.
And also it, and this is what I'm finding at Marley. They do some really horrendous stuff, like to dogs or cattle, to kind of possibly to kind of keep the owner. They're saying, "Look at what we can do,"
Mm-hmm.
and it seems to keep the owner kind of at bay, where he doesn't really try to interfere with whatever their program is. And so you have to take all of that into consideration. And they do play pranks. And Kelleher was telling me about some of the pranks that have gone on. And so it was about 5 months later. I come home from Marley and carry the car keys into the house, and this is very much like they were describing. And again, on the kind of what would normally be considered paranormal activity, and I carry the car keys in, I know, at least into the backyard. And the next time I'm ready to drive the car, I can't find the car keys. And I backtrack, I do everything, no car keys. I search everything. And every morning I take my dog down here to the office, and I keep her lead and collar in this one drawer by the back door. And I pull the drawer open, take it out, put it on her, we go down. And the fifth day, I go in to get her lead, pull open the drawer, and there are the keys on top of her lead.
Wow.
And I've actually investigated a haunted house in Eureka Springs, Arkansas. And those folks went through that big time. I mean, some really incredible stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually got to see some of it while I was there kind of investigating it. And
Okay. What did you see?
well, I was taking digital images, the areas where activity had happened, not to try to catch, an orb or a dust speck or anything like that, but just to document where these events were taking place in case there were changes later. And things would move around. They would be displaced and appear somewhere else. Even some stuffed monkeys that they had. And so anyway, I'm standing there shooting these pictures, and the owner is standing in front of me about 8 feet away. And he said, "Ted," and he had this really bizarre look on his face. And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Behind you." And I turned around, and they have this terrifically heavy chandelier.
Uh-huh.
And I mean, it's so heavy, it's got an iron pinning and is almost on a log chain like chain. And this thing was swinging very slowly, and it kept increasing in the swing. And I flipped the camera around, put it on video, and got some really interesting video of this thing. And all the doors and windows were closed. No air conditioning, no furnace on, nothing to make any kind of current that would have moved this thing. But I'm telling you, it would take something heavy to make that chandelier move at all. And because he and I tried later, but pretty interesting stuff,
Do you think because you're at the center of this study of UFOs and the paranormal, that because you study it, maybe they're doing things specifically to you?
Well, I haven't. Other than the car keys, I really haven't noticed anything. Now, it's a bit frustrating because I'll have, for example, 10 CCD cameras running 24/7, and I walk on the front porch of a cabin that is kind of my office over there, and walk up to the monitors, and all of the cameras stop working. Okay. And I get out there and I can't find anything, any problem, do everything I can do, throw my hands up and say, okay, I'm going to be up all night tonight. I'll go in and take a nap. And I come out, still not working. And 6 hours later, suddenly they all just start working. And I've had that happen numerous times. And there's just no explanation for it. And I've had a whole bank of digital still cameras and video cameras, and also the property owners' cameras, just all stop instantly at the same time. Cell phones stop. One instance, a couple had arrived over there in a brand new Cadillac, one of their neighbors, and the husband stayed in the car, and he has a hard time getting it out of the car, so he just sat in the car. And some of the ambers, I think it was 7 of the ambers, came pretty close and were just stationary. And all of a sudden, the electronic locks on that caddy started opening, closing, locking, unlocking. The radio came on and started running the frequencies, and the alarm system on the car was going off, on, off, on. And when the things disappeared back into themselves or whatever, all that just stopped.
So they're creating some sort of electromagnetic disturbance when they're doing this.
Absolutely, they are. Yeah. And that's one of the things that we found really early on in the trace landing events, is that the soil and the plants wouldn't be burned, charred, anything like that, or even smashed. They were dehydrated. All the moisture sapped out, wilted and dead almost instantly, and just like you'd toss them in a microwave oven. And along with the EM effects that you find on automobile engines, and I've got a catalog of about 800 cases where automobile engines have been affected as an object was close to the automobile. And at Marley, we had a case where a large white object was hovering, and it dropped a beam to the ground, and it was about 600 feet from the farmhouse. And when the owners, after the thing uh, got a little closer and the beam moved with it, lighting up the ground, they looked into the upstairs from their deck, and they saw Christmas tree lights illuminated. And all of the light strings in the upstairs. And when the object finally left, it went straight up, disappeared. They went in to check the Christmas lights, and they weren't plugged in. So that's a pretty good EM pulse to do that.
Do you think that these things, whatever they are, devices, UFOs, are physical when they appear, or do you think that maybe they're non-physical?
Well, I think for sure the old classic saucer types definitely are physical, at least at certain points in time. Because when I go to a landing site, for example, if the object had 3 legs or 4, you'd have the landing pad imprints in the ground. And you could do compaction tests on those imprints and determine pretty closely the weight of the object. And always it would be, depending on the type of object, between 7 and 14 tons. So you're talking about a massive object. And obviously quite physical to put these indentations deeply into the ground and give you that kind of compaction. And so, yeah, I think, and they do a lot of damage to tree limbs or even trees if they come down into a very tight area. And so, yeah, they're definitely physical at some points. But I'm beginning to think, and I'll tell you, I think Allen Hyneks would be one of the first people that would start seeing this himself and not be too surprised that there are points when some of the objects become, as far as the way we think about physical, they become not physical.
Okay.
And so there, you have to be really careful when you say, well, there's an involvement with paranormal activity they generated or whatever. If you're talking about paranormal activities such as ghosts or spirits or anything like that, I think we're looking at a technology that is tremendously advanced. And obviously,
Right.
because they had these things going back in the 20s, and Jacques has found some excellent cases way, way beyond that.
So you don't think that these are ghosts that are appearing
No.
as aliens? They're aliens that are some occupants of the UFOs that are doing something that manifests itself as poltergeist or ghost type activity.
Well, yeah, and that may be it may be a product of their being, or it may be simply an effort to confuse the issue as far as anyone trying to understand it. But you have to remember today, they can make an army tank invisible in broad daylight, and simply by bending light. That has been displayed a number of times. And so I have to go back to Jacques and his books, because this guy has always been a really far thinker. And I think he was more on the path than we were, because we leaned, because of the physical aspect, a little more to, well, these are beings coming here. They're building ships and coming here from somewhere else. And Jacques was always kind of beyond that. And his book, Messengers of Deception, he wrote that back, I think, in the 60s. And I now tend to bend that way, I think, more than I do extraterrestrials.
When you're investigating a landing area, what type of things do you find in that area? Have you ever seen something where they left something behind, maybe that came off the craft that you
No,
thought it was?
no, I have not. I've had, for example, I was coming back from Florida with Jim Lorenzen, who was the director of the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization back in the 60s and so on. And as we're visiting, he said, I want to show you something. And he takes out of a little box a piece of what looked like a metal of some kind, but it was so thin, it was as thin as a piece of cellophane.
Mm-hmm.
And he would do this business, which you hear about Roswell all the time, of crumpling it up in a ball, turning it loose, and it would just flatten out without a wrinkle.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, hold your hand out. And he had this stuff about, 6 or 8 inches above my hand, dropped it, and you couldn't feel it. It absolutely was that light. You could not feel it hit your skin. And so
where did it come
from a landing supposedly in, I believe it was Finland.
Mm-hmm.
And he was flying from Florida to Washington, D.C. to turn it over to a government lab. And, of course, that was the end of that piece of whatever it was.
And this was well before anyone knew anything about Roswell and the story behind it of this type of material.
Yeah, this was in '69, I believe.
And you handled this yourself.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What other things have you discovered about specifically about landing areas that make that area different from the surrounding areas?
Well, what you find, there are 3 primary types of evidence, and that is the area is either depressed, burnt, or dehydrated. Mm-hmm. And the burnt areas and the depressed areas are about equal in quantity. And but the dehydrated areas are much, much more interesting as far as laboratory analysis and what you might be able to find. But in the depressed areas, you generally will have a circular area where it's kind of like a donut. The central area, the alfalfa, the tall grass, whatever's there, is standing normally. And there will be a 1 foot to 1.5 foot wide ring mm-hmm. where the plants are not only depressed, but swirled in a very, very tight pattern. And it's pretty fascinating stuff. Mm-hmm. And we just had 3 new ones at Marley about 3 weeks ago. And they were all identical size and configuration and so on. And typically, you don't find any kind of measurable traces in the depressed sites. We did have one there that was an oval site in last July, and it had at the north end of the oval a circular 2-foot area that was pretty highly radioactive. And that's not normal. Very few of the sites have radioactivity. And the burn sites typically will not be circular. They'll be irregular. Mm-hmm. And as the object was coming in or going out, it spread the effect rather than having that symmetrical pattern. And the dehydrated sites, the majority of those are circular and about 8 to 10 feet in diameter.
You know, we've had a lot of triangle UFO sightings, triangular shaped mm-hmm. craft. Have you ever found a triangular pattern on the ground?
I did, and it was back in those days. You didn't really think, there were not very many sightings of a triangular object, mm-hmm. and this was in 1975, and there was a landing here in Missouri, and the rancher saw the object on there, and he had 3 extremely serious, big security dogs. And he turns them off their leads and told them to go. And they ran about 20 feet, stopped, and crawled on their bellies backwards. And he said, when that happened, I decided to go in the house and wait till morning to go down there. And but he found a dehydrated cedar tree about 15 feet from the site. The site actually was an oval, dehydrated, very dehydrated area. And there were 3 imprints, small, very unusual imprints in a very elongated triangular pattern. And now what's interesting, for the first time ever in Marley in January of this year, we had a guy and his wife report a triangular shaped object device about 3 feet above the ground, and it was about 4 feet long and a equilateral triangle. And they could see it had a kind of between a metallic and a almost plastic looking skin on the structure. And it was silent and no illumination. They walked up on it because their dog was out there going crazy. And he had a pretty powerful flashlight and shined it on it. And it stayed there for 15, 20 seconds and then silently went vertical and disappeared. And it had no light on it at all. So that's another new thing. And what's great about this stuff, when you think you've pretty well seen it all, something new and even better or weirder comes along, believe me.
Well, you have all of this physical evidence over almost 4,000 cases of landings. Why hasn't the scientific community taken a serious look at this?
Well, that's a really good question. And, Allen Hyneks was a highly respected and well-known and distinguished scientist. And he chose his words very carefully because he had to. And he and I tried for quite a long while. We were best of friends for about 18 years until he passed on. And we were able to get only one research grant for $4,000. And that was back in 1974. We made good use of it. But and we did presentations to the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. And we had meetings with the AIAA UFO subcommittee with Peter Sturrock, chairman. And they talked seriously about it. They were seriously interested. But you take them out of those closed rooms and they don't know anything.
You're right.
And it's a peer thing, totally. Because they want to keep getting research grants, and they don't want, to have people thinking they should be in a psychiatric ward. And that's the unfortunate thing, because the media has played a big part in this, the government a lot, but also the media. I've watched them, how they handled this unknown yet missile or whatever it was out in the ocean off of L.A., And here you have video, very clearly shows it. And the object at the head of the contrail looks a little odd. But the media all day long has been this tongue-in-cheek, is it a flying saucer? And they chuckle and have a lot of fun with it. So why would any witness report a sighting at all?
Right. Because
they know clearly what's going to happen. And so many of the documentaries that you have on TV, you'll see the Iowa farm family, the guy, his wife, and 15 kids, and they give them 30 seconds to say, yeah, it was right up there, it did this. Okay, well, that sounds really weird. Thank you. And then they bring on, after a commercial, a psychologist or a skeptic to discredit the farm family,
Right.
So The only way I get all these cases at Marley is I almost live there, and everyone knows me. And the one thing they asked me when they invited me down was to please never make public the location or any of the witnesses' names.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, absolutely. And I've held to that, and they know that. And so when something happens, I get a call sometimes while it's even going on.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to develop that rapport. You have to let people know that it's not going to go to the media.
Mm-hmm.
You and I can talk about the cases all we want,
Mm-hmm.
as long, as I stay away from the stuff I can't talk about.
The videos that you've shot there, is there anything that you've released?
Not yet. As a matter of fact, having a really nice website built.
Mm-hmm.
A gentleman offered to do it for me, and that's really his thing, and it'll be a nice one. And I have been so busy at Marley and a couple of other projects. One of them in Slovakia. That's one that really takes a lot of time to have to go over there. But I'm dragging my feet on getting the material to be posted to him and so on. But I will have some video clips. And gosh, I've got now hours of video, and some of it is really crummy, but it shows something is there that shouldn't be there, and is terrifically unusual. And it's only crummy because the farmer sees some of these things, and for the first time in his entire life, he goes into Walmart and he buys a video recorder. And goes out, and he really doesn't know how to run it. And I have the biggest problem convincing people they need to put it on a tripod.
Right.
And it's like they've got to hold it in their hands, and you know what that results in.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, it's evidence. And but the CCD cameras, of course, are all sturdily mounted. And when something happens, I just obtained last week, about 11 minutes of video of an object on the ground through trees, beams of light coming out of it vertically, and then it comes out of the trees and makes its way higher in the sky before it just zaps out. And it's that odd amber color, circular in shape. And I hope to put that on the website when we get it going.
When you get video like this, is it night vision, or is it color, clear and color video?
Well, I try to keep it clear in color. The CCD cameras, most of them are color and some night vision. And the objects, what I've found is they're bright enough, generally, that you can shoot them with just about any kind of even cheesy video camera without night vision, which of course is the best if you can do it. And the best thing I've found, I had a chance to get my hands on a little Kodak Play Sport video camera. And I mean, this is really a pocket-sized job. And all you've got to do is pop the power, pop the on button, and it's recording. And you don't have to worry about the thing searching back and forth, going in and out of focus. It's always in focus at infinity. And it picks up, the planet Jupiter. And these objects, by and large, are way, way brighter than Venus or anything you see in the sky short of the moon. And so it works really well, and the color is great.
And Marley Woods this place is not actually called Marley Woods, right?
No.
That's
no,
just a name made up.
Yeah, I went on Google Earth, and I searched everywhere for a couple of 100 miles around this location to be sure there was nothing there called the Woods or something Woods or Marley or anything like that. And I don't know, I was just thinking of Marley for some reason. And I thought, well, Marley Woods, that sounds good.
And
so
you can't tell us what state it's in either.
No, I really can't.
Yeah.
I really can't.
I understand.
I tell you, I honestly, so many times I've tried to tell an audience or whatever, I wish I didn't have to jump through hoops talking about some of this stuff. But that's even true of some of the really high strangeness landing cases from even years back. Once you tell people, witnesses, that you're not going to do it, I can't do it. So.
And if you ever give that location out, you're going to have hoaxers show up making lights, putting balloons in the air, things like that, that would interfere with your research.
Oh, well, absolutely. Not only that, these ranches are secured, and they have caretakers who have guns. And without any question, if anybody tried to go over a fence or a gate and not stop when they told them to, they'd be in big trouble.
Right.
And they wouldn't hesitate to do it because they have a lot of very valuable cattle, along with machinery and, a lot of stuff there that you wouldn't want, for example, 10,000 people busting down fences to get in and see the lights and so on.
Right.
And I ran into that up in Langenburg, Saskatchewan. Edwin Fuhrer saw 5 metallic objects down in the tops of some 4 or 5 foot tall grass in daylight one Sunday morning. And they were dome shaped, and they were rotating very quickly. He walked up within 15 feet of the lead object and pretty quickly backed up and got back on his, what we would call a combine, and could then see the 5 objects and the grass moving underneath each, and they were spinning rapidly. Wow. And out of one of the objects, he sees 2 long sort of pipes or rods that come out in a V configuration, and they're both moving around the horizontal axis, and the grass is moving where they're moving. And suddenly they take off with no sound in a step formation and go straight up. And it was a cloudy, drizzly morning, and cloud ceiling was 3,000 feet. They stopped just under the clouds and formed a straight line. There was a terrific gust of wind or something that came out of 2 pipe-like extensions on the base of each of the objects, and they disappeared into the clouds. And he waited 5 minutes to be sure they weren't coming back, got off the combine and walked back up, and he found 5 rings where these objects had been, and the V configuration where the tall grass was beat down by these 2 rods. And in each of the rings, the central area was standing normally. And so my theory on that has always been, and I have it with a number of those types of sightings where they're swirled and packed down tightly, is a device like that with 2 openings at the base, which can eject a powerful blast of something. If they're sitting there in the grass, spinning, not on the ground, you're going to get that packed down clockwise situation. And but that was an excellent case. But by the time Allen found out about it, called me, had me go up there. There had been the RCMP estimated about 8,000 people through there, and the rings were no more. But luckily, the RCMPs did a magnificent job investigating the case and photographing the area and the rings and everything before the herd got there. So, I can't imagine anybody that would want to advertise something like that had happened.
Exactly. Ted, I got time for one more question. Do you
Okay.
think that there will be some sort of disclosure that will ever have a solution to this mystery?
I think the only way that that might happen would be if a group of scientists seriously looked at this stuff. And my hopes in that respect would be with a guy like Michio Kaku, because I understand he has some interest in UFOs, and he's made the statement, why not?
Exactly.
Uh, and this guy has, I think, such stature, and he chooses his words carefully too, which he has to.
Hmm.
Beyond that, other than if there is a disclosure on the part of whatever this is,
Right.
I don't think the government will ever try to back out of it. They've really painted themselves in a corner, and I can't imagine any president going on a global news conference and saying our past presidents and Congress has been lying to the American public for 60 years, 70 years.
Exactly.
I can't see that.
Ted, thank you so much for being my guest on Conundrums.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it. Thanks.
Okay, and we'll have another program next week. Stay tuned and be sure to bookmark the site, and we'll have Ted back again.
And was pretty fascinated with it. And my dad was at a local radio station, and the newsman there, Bob Younger, had been a bomber pilot in World War II. And knowing my interest, Dad said, well, let me introduce you to this guy. I think you'll like to talk to him. And Bob was flying a night intruder bomber over Europe, and had an entire wing of these bombers. And all of a sudden, they see a circular bright object coming in from their right, and it flies very close, very near, and over the bomber complement. And as it went over, the planes were actually rocked by some kind of air disturbance. And they watched, and after it cleared the bombers, without hesitating, it reversed direction and flew back underneath, again gyrating the bombers. And that really hooked me when I actually got to talk to this guy. And many years later, he saw me on an NBC news television news show, and he, over the years, had pulled together all of the names of all the crew members, plane numbers, every detail, and sent them to me. And that, I thought that was, quite exceptional.
How old were you
And
when you first met this man? How old were you?
I was, let's see, I was 12.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. Then in 1964, we had the Socorro, New Mexico landing.
Hmm.
And I went down and was looking into that. Well, Allen Hyneks was there, but we didn't know each other from anyone. And 4 years later, I ran onto an exceptional case. It was a physical trace case, multiple witness, daylight, investigated all. And he said, we need to start specializing in particular types of events. And so after he went through a litany of types of events, he said, would you be willing to go into physical traces from UFO landing cases? And I said, sure. And the really cool thing was a year later at my first presentation with Hynek and Vallee and Andrus and the Lorenzens and in the front row, and I was a little nervous. And I had 157 cases, and everybody was blown away. That many landings with traces.
Yes.
And the file now is just below 4,000 from 93 countries.
4,000 cases where UFOs have landed on the ground and disturbed the ground in some way?
Yes, where the UFO is actually seen generating the trace.
Is this worldwide or in the United States?
93 countries.
Do you go to other countries and investigate landings?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Not as much anymore because I'm pretty well tied down with the Marley Woods. Mm-hmm. And that's quite a big project for me now.
Tell me about Marley Woods. This is something that you're currently investigating, right?
Yes. Yeah. 12 years ago, I had a call from one of the witnesses and asking me if I would be willing to come down and help them out with some really odd stuff that was going on. And I almost turned it down because there were no physical trace cases. And he did mention to me, he said, we have taken some video. So I thought, okay, I can do a trip for that. And after I talked to these people, they were, high quality witnesses. And the gentleman's a banker and a rancher. And so as I visited the area more and more, I actually...
Ted Phillips is our guest tonight on Conundrums. Ted goes way back in the UFO field. He used to work with Dr. Allen Hyneks, and he has formed the Center for Physical Trace Research. This is where you investigate actual UFO landings, and you'd be surprised how many there are. Ted Phillips is next on Conundrums. Tonight on Conundrums, we're talking with Ted Phillips of the Center for Physical Trace Research. Ted, thank you for being on Conundrums.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Well, let's just get right into it. You started in ufology, back with Dr. Allen Hyneks, right? Tell me about your beginnings in this field.
Yeah, actually, I started having an interest in it when I was 9. And listening to some of the military reports that were being reported over the Mutual radio network. After 5 months, had the opportunity for the first time ever to see something I couldn't identify. Okay. And since that time, I've seen a lot. And I'm really amazed to be able to say that.
What did you see?
Well, what I saw, the owner and I of the North Ranch were standing out by an old windmill, just sort of going over cases. And all of a sudden he says, there they are. And I look up, and it's twilight, but it's still very bright. Mm-hmm. And in the northeast, There are three amber-colored devices, and they're in a horizontal row. No sound, no wings, no motors, nothing, no means of support that you could see. And parachutes, smoke, anything like that would have been quite visible. And a fourth one comes on more to the east, and then a fifth one. The fifth one was actually quite close, about 800 feet away, and probably 600 feet above the ground. And so I'm staying there just transfixed by this thing. And they were so different from anything I would have expected. Had it been a metallic disc with little guys crawling all over it, I would have been comfortable with it. But this was way, way different. And the things looked to be about 12 feet vertically, about 8 feet horizontally. And the entire face was this odd amber color, and it was extremely bright yet soft. Very difficult to explain the appearance. Yeah. And coming around the outside edge from the top and down around the bottom and up the other side, configuring a U shape, was a band of the oddest purple blue color I've ever seen. And backlight UFO on the ground taking off 300 feet from these guys, and they shot 2 photos of it, daylight, sharp images, best I've ever seen of a UFO. And so anyway, this was an exceptional thing, and I thought, well, I'll just take a shot, and I called Northwestern University, and Mary, Allen's secretary, said, hang on, and surprised the devil out of me. He comes on, and we talked for about 15 minutes, and he said, can we talk to the witnesses and see the pictures? And I said, sure. So he flew down to Columbia, Missouri in a couple of weeks, and after that, I gave him a number of cases that I'd investigated on my own, and he takes them back to Chicago, and about 2 weeks calls and invites me to come up for a couple of days. And I spent those 2 days talking with Fred Beckman, and Bill Powers at Northwestern. And he asked me if I would like to join his investigative group, which was known as the Invisible College. And considering the fact working with J. Allen and Jacques Vallee, I mean, come on, what are you going to say,
right.
You know?
Now, did the things that the information that you fed to him, did they end up in Project Blue Book, or was this after Blue Book?
No, this was actually during Blue Book. This was in 1968, and they did not go into Blue Book. Allen kind of sat on them, and because at that point he was convinced if he gave any of this stuff to Blue Book, it will just go down the rat hole to some other agency. That was quite apparent.
Okay. And at what point did you start the Center for Physical Trace Research?
That was in 1998. And in 1968, Alan and I were having dinner in St. Louis, and he said, you know, we have so much stuff coming in, we can't